I'm Engseng, the director of the Middle East Institute. We have had an interesting conference. This morning's, we left the hottest panel for the morning because we knew people would be tired and sleepy in the morning. So I'm happy to see that the morning panel raised a number of interesting issues, and I must say, very thoughtful, considered questions from the audience. And in that spirit, we have a very distinguished audience, which includes our previous speakers, and many issues have been raised in this conference, which have not always had the time to be addressed due to time constraints. What I'd like to do with this closing roundtable is to actually make it a roundtable which includes everybody in the audience. So the speakers will kick off the roundtable with their comments, and then I would like to open it up to the audience, not simply to ask the speakers questions one-to-one about their presentations, but to bring up what you think are more general issues, pressing issues, which we all should be thinking about. And in terms of the ground rules, I will point to who should be speaking when you have a question. And I would say this: if you have something to say, give me one finger. But if you have something to say which is on the topic being discussed, give me two fingers. Then I will, not a middle finger, two fingers. One finger is this finger, two fingers are these two fingers, and these are the only fingers acceptable. Uh, Middle finger is, it will be invisible to me. And if you have two fingers, then you can jump into the discussion, because we really want the discussion to be more intense and deeper and so on. Okay, so these are the basic ground rules. Let me just start off by putting out some thoughts. I had mentioned in my welcome address that I think one of the major issues underlying the expansion of the Belt and Road is this question of when the West went east. Um, that is also known as the history of colonialism, especially in the Muslim world. The Muslim world is a huge world in the middle between Europe and Asia. And that huge world in the middle, in a sense, became Muslim because it was very interconnected. And I believe, as a scholar of Islamic networks, that Islam is a religion and a set of societies which were very interconnected and very networked. If you think of the calendar as a lunar calendar, wherever you are in the world, you can see what phase of the moon you are in. So when you have Ramadan, the start of it has historically been moon sighting. What this means essentially is this: that you do not need a central authority generating a calendar. Wherever you are, you have that calendar with you. So it is a very modular sort of enterprise. And this modular sort of enterprise is part of what I think is a very interconnected part of the world. And in that sense, what we call Islam, Islamic society, Muslim societies, has very deep and broad networked aspects to it. So this, I think, is the overall way I see it. So when the West went eastwards through the Islamic world, when they conquered this Islamic world, they had to deal with many of these networks. And I think the British, they had some fights with someone they call the Mad Mullah in Sudan and places like that. But overall, the British learned to work with these networks. Just as in this part of the world, the British work with overseas Chinese networks. And so, to me, when China moves eastwards, I believe China will have to deal with these sorts of networks one way or another. Now, China has not been a world power for a long time. Our distinguished historian of China in Singapore, Professor Wang, the way he puts it is that China has been a world power, but it is out of practice. It has not had a navy, a world-class navy for 500 years. So I think there are legitimate issues to be raised up in terms of China's expansion eastwards. The way I put it at the beginning was, will China do it differently? And in this sense, I think China has many models to think about. We have the recent history of the past 30 years in which the US has been the dominant world power. And I think China and Chinese, as they have learned to become a world power again, the US actually has been a great model for China, has been a major model for China. But the fear I have is that the US as a model for China, I mean, yes, China may in fact fall into the traps of mistakes the US may have done, or American thinking. And in that sense, the US is a major model for China today, as the US is a major model for Singapore. And what we like to do in the Middle East Institute is to think about these connections historically and today, and to think deeply about them. Now, we have a problem in the Middle East Institute that we have a number of, actually a big set of KPIs. The KPIs are also numerical KPIs, and if we don't hit them, they will claw back funds, which will come out of my own pocket. So we do try to hit the KPIs, and I'm happy to report that we hit 150% of our numerical KPIs last year at below budget. But that actually is a trap, because if you hit all those numerical KPIs, you actually don't have much time for deep thinking. So that's what we have to do. We want to do deep thinking, but we also have to hit our KPIs. And one way I think we can do both is to have a mix of academic researchers, policy analysts, and practitioners. And I think this mixture of policy, practitioner, and academics is one way in which we can both hit our KPIs and do the sort of deep thinking I think we all need to do today. So just with that, I will start the roundtable. We will have Professor Wang Suolao, Deputy Director of the Institute of Area Studies and Associate Professor in the School of International Studies at Peking University. Each one of them has given me a title, but as I've said, this is just to kick off our roundtable, and Professor Wang's title is How Can China Avoid Falling into the Geopolitical Trap in the Middle East?
Thank Professor He, and thanks the Middle East Institute invite me to come to this beautiful country from Beijing. Now it's a chilly weather. After first session, I hope we could have another easy topic to talk, but unfortunately, it seems to me no way. My topic on how can China avoid falling into the geopolitical trap in the Middle East. How to have this? I think this is because Professor He gave me the task to talk about the geopolitics of China in the Middle East. So I will talk on something. First, what does geopolitics mean for Chinese government? And then take the historical and superpowers lessons, and then one by one role, initiative, and strategic partners, and then challenge ahead. First, what does geopolitics mean for Chinese government? Professor He, if I speak too much, please stop me directly, no problem. Because there are many people from academics, universities, maybe they disagree with the government, but now I think I should first introduce Chinese government, how they think geopolitics. For Chinese government, geopolitics is not to some extent good word. It's a negative word. For Chinese government, it means political interest, sphere of influence, interference, proxy, zero-sum game, and to force buying and selling that are superior to others. This word or speeches, I put it up from the speeches of foreign minister and our top leaders. So, nearly 2 years ago, our foreign minister Wang, when he met Palestinian foreign minister, he said that He said what? China always played a positive and constructive role in the Middle East for years. China has no political consideration, no geopolitical consideration in its role in the Middle East, nor intention to make a balance with any other country. This is nearly 2 years ago. And then several months later, when he met Jordanian foreign minister, once again, he repeated, China pursues no geographical interest and seeks no sphere of influence in the Middle East, and will not be partial to any party. It's from the foreign minister. It's very clear that no interest for foreign ministry of geopolitical interest. And then what about our top leader? Our top leader, President Xi, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when he visited Cairo, Arab headquarters, he said that in its policy and measures toward the Middle East, China insists to start from the own merits and demerits of affairs and proceed from the fundamental interests of the people in the Middle East. And then he said, instead of looking for proxy in the Middle East, China promotes peace talks. And instead of seeking any sphere of influence, China calls on all countries to join the circle of friends for the Belt and Road. And instead of attempting to fill the vacuum, China builds a cooperative partnership network for mutual benefits and win-win results. Our question is, who looking for proxy in the Middle East? And who seeking sphere of influence in the Middle East? And who attempting to fill the vacuum in the Middle East? I know you know that. I'm sure you know more than me about our country or our foreign policy. To be honestly, for my whole life I studied this issue, but still I cannot totally understand the government. So now I'm share my research with you. And then last year in the Boao Asian annual conference, once again our top leader said, China does not engage in petty calculations in geopolitical games or engage in closed and exclusive circles or in forced buying and selling that are superior to us, to others. That's why I use the words of our top leaders. So that means for our top leader and Chinese government, geopolitics is not a good thing, especially in the Middle East. So how come that conclusion? Now I would like to use this word. Although geopolitical thinking cannot solve the problem, it has not disappeared, especially for traditional big countries. For Chinese government, geopolitical thinking cannot resolve the problem. This is very clear. So who said this? Another Chinese top diplomat, Fu Ying. When he said that, she was director of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the National People's Congress. And she said that in Moscow Volodya Discussion Club. He further concluded, the conclusion is that transcending geopolitics is not only the personal experiences of China's development, but also the trend of the world's development. She explained, when she go to Moscow, she discussed this issue, geopolitics, with many Chinese leading scholars. And many Chinese leading scholars conclude that China should transcend geopolitics. So I think this is Chinese government. So instead, China suggests the world should join hands to build a community of shared future for mankind instead of retreating into a geopolitical game. Okay, so what's the relationship between one Belt, one Road and geopolitics? I found the thing is strategic partners. That means China's solution is to build as more as can to establish strategic partners with many countries, especially in the Middle East. So this is the words from our top leader, President Xi Jinping. She said, respect each other's core interests and major concerns and engage in dialogue without confrontation and companionship. We will not only engage in the new road of mutual respect with the country, but also the zero-sum game that you win and win. So, as I found, in the Middle East, the first country China announced to establish strategic partnership was Egypt in the year 1999. But from 1999 to 2012, 13 years, China only established strategic partnership with only 5 Middle Eastern countries. That was Egypt, Algeria, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, UAE. But since the start of One Belt One Road initiative in the year 2013 until last year, 5 years, China announced to establish strategic partnership with 9 Middle Eastern countries. That is Qatar, Sudan, Jordan, Iraq, Iran, Morocco, Israel, Oman, Kuwait. Kuwait was the last one, last year. And also during this period, China promote or new established with 5 Middle Eastern countries with a comprehensive partnership. That is Algeria, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, UAE. You can count on those 5 countries are the most important strategic partners for China in the Middle East. But you already found those countries, except Iran, they are also American allies. American allies. How many American allies are those China's strategic partners? Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Jordan, Kuwait, Egypt, Iraq, and maybe others. So, for China, the top leader said, we want to establish partnership with countries, but not make allies. So that means American allies, at the same time, they can also be China's partners. No problem. So how to make this happen? I think is One Belt, One Road. That is, China supply with the public goods for the Middle East. I think One Belt, One Road is a contribution of China to the whole world. That is public goods. Because many people think China, we don't have public goods for the world. I think we have. One Belt, One Road is. For instance, in the Middle East, we all know there are so many conflicting countries. Israel, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. But at the same time, they are all China's partners. China don't care about their own struggle. But actually, maybe this is not the accurate word. We care, but it's hard for us to salute it. Even United States, no way to find the correct solutions. So now, this is my own thinking. Before that, it's a government expression of government positions. My own thinking is that China policy, especially our Middle Eastern policy, although we not promote geopolitics interest or geopolitical consideration, but China really faces severe challenges ahead. In the Middle East, we know there are a lot of problems. First, regime change. We are in the last 8 years, Arab Spring. So many China's old friends stepped down or overthrew Hosni Mubarak, and you see many of them. I don't count everyone. But in the Libya issue, we know when Libya has a war, China withdraw 30,000 Chinese workers back from Middle East. From Yemen, China also withdraw our workers. And now in the Middle East, the Sudan, just now, Sudanese president, a long-term president, 30 years, now face the demonstrations every day. And Algeria, as I know, the very old president, Bouteflika, China's very old friend in the Middle East, he wants to make another presidential term although he's very ill, 81 years old. They're all Chinese friends, Bashir, Sudan's president. When those countries have another round of spring, so-called spring, I'm sure there's some uncertainty of that country there because they are China's partners, strategic partners. If Democrats, free Democrats go to the power, we don't know. Maybe the relationship will go smooth like Tunisia and other Arab Spring countries. But anyway, uncertainty. Another issue is sectarian conflict, Sunni Shia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Gulf conflict, that make a great concern for China energy because more than half of China's crude oil from the Middle East, especially from the Gulf region. I think China is a country, the sincere country to want to have peace in the Middle East. No, I think this is very clear because we are different from Russia. We are different from the United States. We need import oil, natural gas from the Middle East. So who really hope Middle East enjoy the peace and stability? I'm sure China. Sure. So how to make that? We don't know. Especially now, since 1.5 years ago, Qatar, GCC country, Saudi Arabia, the cut off their relationship. And just 1 month ago, Qatar Emir with China, we signed a lot of accords and agreements. So how Saudi Arabia at that? So, they are all China's partners, China's good friends. So we don't know. And big powers proxy war, Syrian war. China, until now, we have a reservation about Russia's military interference in Syria. But at the same time, China and Russia, we are very good partner, very close relationship. So, but because Syria issues, so we share, of course we share common interests, but we have different opinions. And Kurdish issue is another headache issue. China opposes any suggestion for the referendum. For clear, I know you understand. That is China, of course, last year, the 2 years ago, Kurdish referendum, China, of course, opposed. So, and many other headache issues in the Middle East. But I think first session, I heard a lot of criticism about China. I hope participants give China room, give China a chance, and give China's time. We are a rising power in the Middle East. We don't want to create trouble in the Middle East. We want to bring peace and stability and economic benefits to the Middle Eastern countries. I believe no perfect country in the world, no ideal countries in the world. We must know this. This is not preaching. This is my belief. As scholars, we want to try to find a way to solve problems. We don't want to create problems. So I think in the future, I believe China will do better in the Middle East. Will play a good role in the Middle East. But until now, it's not our capacity. It's not our time. Thank you for your patience.
Next, we have Ehud Yaari of the Laffer International Fellow at the Washington Institute. And Mr. Yaari, I think, will say, according to his title, The Middle East, China Loves Us All.
Good morning. I work also in television, prime time, and it's 6 o'clock Israel time. So I'm not necessarily in agreement with what I'm going to tell you. Please take me with a grain of salt. Important remark, in my opinion. We speak about the Middle East. It's the Middle East. And the Middle East is in a hastened process of both shrinking and expanding. Where are the borders of that Middle East? Is it the Iran-Afghanistan border? And I could go on and on. My argument is the Middle East, at the same time that it's shrinking basically to the old Levant, it's also expanding back into Central Asia, the Caucasus, the Balkans, the Sahel, etc. So you will find Chechens fighting in Syria, not just Uyghurs, and Ingushetian police and Dagestani volunteers, and Israel is involved in the battle against the Islamic extremists in the Western Africa, in the Sahel, and I could go on and on and on. So it's the Middle East. And I would like to take it with your permission from an Israeli perspective, although Israel was not even mentioned on one of the maps presented here yesterday, which I couldn't help but notice. Israel has performed a pivot to Asia over quite a few years, because the political conviction of the current prime minister, I'm not sure how long he's staying, but the conviction of the prime minister was and is that first we go to the world, we mend fences all around the globe, then we get to the Arab states, then hopefully at one point we will be able to deal with the Palestinians, our immediate neighbors, who so far refuse to accept a deal. It takes different forms, this going abroad approach. We have what I call the Jewish, I have a Greek brother-in-law, so I'm proud that we have what I call the Jewish Hellenic Alliance in the East Med, Israel, Cyprus, Greece. You go all over the Western Mediterranean and the Balkans, you will see squadrons of the Israeli Air Force training with them. We have established a bloc, a sort of a semi-alliance with the most important East African states. The peace, which was gratefully proclaimed now between Eritrea and Ethiopia, was a joint venture between the UAE, KSA, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, backed by the United States. And when we come, and there is Eastern Europe, the Visegrad states, etc., a string of alliances that was formed over the past decade. And Asia plays prominently into this. Israel, I have to be blunt and honest with you, Israel prefers the Indo-Pacific concept. It is much more comfortable with the Indo-Pacific concept. With Australia, our friends, my wife is Aussie, although she was born in Shanghai, with the United States. Our Prime Minister has cultivated very excellent personal relationships with Prime Minister Abe and Prime Minister Modi. I'll tell you a secret. When Modi sends messages to Bibi, it's in Hebrew. Yes, Mrs. Ambassador, in Hebrew. He makes right. And also, but although we have that preference for the Indo-Pacific concept and what is incorporated in it, it's China as well. And the Prime Minister is pushing his ministries and the Israeli business community to seek relationships with China and Chinese companies. We have by now, I think Israel is the only one which has a sort of a treaty of innovation with China. We know why China is coming to us, for our technologies. And we know why we go to China, because it's China and it has a big market. When we in Israel look at the BRI, we see that the Chinese, smart as they are bypassing the heart of the Middle East. They skip it, rightly so. But when we see the maritime belt, what we see is an opportunity for an extension of the sea lane going through the Red Sea, not necessarily exclusively to the clogged up Suez Canal, was mentioned the other day, but also going through the Gulf of Eilat, the Gulf of Aqaba, to Israel, or it doesn't make much difference, to Jordan. Because the plan is for a system of railways which will connect the Israeli railway system to the railway system in the Arab world, with a hub in Irbid, northern Jordan. So you will be able to ship from anywhere to both our ports, in Haifa and Ashdod. Both of them are partly now going to be run by Chinese companies. In brackets, I made a comment the other day. There is no problem for the Chinese to manage the private part, the privatized part of Haifa port. They already took hold last week, I think, of the first 40 acres, 40, 50 acres. It's not going to affect whether the Sixth Fleet is coming to Haifa. They will come. The Americans have lots of prepositioning in Israel. They will keep coming. And if there is any sensitivity, it would be because we keep in Haifa our fleet of submarines said to have a second strike nuclear capability. I don't know anything about that. So we have the Chinese now investing in Israel to the tune of 25% of all new investments in the past 3-4 years in Israeli high-tech. And when I say Israeli high-tech, it's also water technologies, pharma, everything. Driverless cars, in which Israel in some ways is leading, and the Chinese are very interested. So 20 to 25% of investments in Israeli high-tech come from China. And just to be fair, from Japan, it has grown over the past decade 12 times their investments. India is a huge success story because India is buying a lot of Israeli military equipment. And when one day, it's a fact, when one day the Indian Blue Navy is going to watch the Chinese Blue Navy in the Indian Ocean along the sea lanes carrying of the oil tankers, the Indian Navy is equipped with Israeli missiles, etc., etc., etc. In fact, we have 3 decades of different decades of relationship between Israel and China. The first, the basis was like India today, military. An American veto prevented Israel from entering the Chinese market with military hardware. The deal to sell the Falcon intelligence planes had to be broken. The same goes for the Harpy drones for electronic warfare, and that was it. Second decade was mainly about agriculture. There's lots of Israeli activity all over China, agriculture. Since then, it's mainly high-tech. Chinese companies are interested in taking over many of the biggest Israeli companies, corporations. They've taken over one of the symbols of Israel, the dairy company, the great dairy company, Tnuva. They have some difficulty. They have begun to lose some money there, but they will fix it. They bought the Israeli big fertilizer company, now called Adama. It used to be called Israel Chemicals. And they are trying to go into the financial sector. But the Chinese have been prevented by different Israeli regulators from buying insurance firms and investment houses. Being Israeli, I'm blunt, I'll give you an example. China wanted to buy 2 of the 4 biggest Israeli insurance companies, and the regulator said no. In one case, the reason was that that insurance company, Phoenix, is running the pensions of everybody in the military, intelligence, and security services. Can you understand this regulator? They were trying to buy another one. They wanted to get a big investment house in Israel, Meitavdash, and they were prevented. So it's very clear that the Israelis are trying now to follow in the footsteps, if you want, of Australia. And a commission is now drafting a set of rules on where the Chinese investments can go and where they are not to be allowed to go. Notably, for example, cyber. Chinese would like to get some of the cyber technologies that Israel has developed over many years. Israel is very sensitive about it, and also the United States is very sensitive about it. So where we stand now is that we have a trade with China, which got to $13 billion a year. It's unbalanced. And to be fair, I have to tell you that most of the Israeli exports to China are chips developed and produced in Israel by Intel, and the fertilizers, which are produced by that company mentioned before, that China has bought from Israel Chemicals. Not much trade going. The ones who excel in importing from China, amongst others, are the Palestinians. From the city, it's just as an anecdote, from the city of Hebron, they have taken over the imports of all sorts of gadgets, toys, whatever you can think of in China. And for anybody who is acquainted with the Palestinian scene, Hebron is like Venice. at the time, Venice had a fleet of ships. Hebron has a fleet of trucks and communities of Hebronites all over the place, not just in Israel or the Palestinian territory. So it's going a lot. I believe, to conclude, that we will see a further flourishing of Israeli-Chinese trade. I believe we will see more investments coming. I will see more companies from China, like Huawei and others, opening their R&D, their research and development facilities in Israel, like many American firms do. But there will be very clear limits. That is, what Israel will do with Japan or India, certainly America, it may not necessarily do with China. Thank you.
Thank you, Ehud, for giving us a very clear demonstration of the tensions we tried to bring out in the title, China's BRI between geostrategy and commercial opportunity. I think Professor Wang had said that China does not like geostrategy. Mr. Yaari said, actually, we are part of the Indo-Pacific, which is a geostrategic concept, as part of an American alliance on the one hand, but on the other hand, Israel has a lot of economic relations with China. So I think Israel is navigating very nicely the gap between commercial opportunity and geostrategy. I was asking Professor Wang, I didn't see China on the list of allies in the list he put up. And Professor Wang says, actually, China is a partner, but a comprehensive, innovative partner, not a strategic partner because Israel is a strategic partner with America. So I think both on the Chinese side, on the Israeli side, they are doing quite a good job navigating between geostrategy and commercial opportunity. With that, I'd like to pass the floor to Dr. Jon Alterman, Senior Vice President, Brzezinski Chair in Global Security and Geostrategy, Director of the Middle East Program, CSIS, Separating Geostrategy from Opportunism, BRI, and the Future of the Middle East. And I think we see this trend of keeping geostrategy and opportunity on both sides or not. I don't know. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ho. It's a pleasure to be back at the Middle East Institute. I'm constantly amazed at how much bang for the buck China has gotten for the Belt and Road Initiative, because if you think about it in absolute terms, China hasn't really expended as much as it gets credit for expending. The extent to which the Belt and Road Initiative has created tremendous enthusiasm in just a short period of time, I think it is remarkable, if not unprecedented. There is a presumption that China is both a fast rising power and also an actor that is deeply strategic and centrally controlled. And that has excited governments throughout the Middle East about what the Belt and Road Initiative might mean for them. They seek to establish themselves almost to a country with an idea that they can become a central node in China's Belt and Road strategy. There have been countless senior visits to China. President Xi visited Iran, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt. And I think there's also a certain glow that comes from largely authoritarian states in the Middle East looking at China as a model for their own both political management and economic development. I think the prospect of China sweeping into the Middle East is especially enticing for governments that believe that the United States, between its growing energy independence and a certain amount of fatigue with ongoing conflicts in the Middle East, is beginning to turn away from the region. Saudi Arabia is actively seeking to deepen its ties with China, not only because China is such an important global oil consumer, also to ensure that China doesn't side with Iran too much, and Saudi Arabia very strategically ensured that it supplies more oil to China than Iran does. And I think also Saudi Arabia is trying to build more Chinese support because it is growing increasingly uncertain that Western support will be enduring. Iran is seeking to build ties with China principally as a counterweight to what it sees as US domination, but also because China is one of the few sources of capital that Iran can turn to in the world. Egypt sees China as an important source of capital that is free of a sort of political judgment. They see China quite explicitly as a model for economic growth, for political organization, and they see China as especially interested in Egypt because of Egypt's location astride the important trade routes that lead from China to Europe. I think all of this happens with a view that the orientation the Middle East has had toward the United States for somewhere between 30 and 70 years, depending on the country, has largely been a mixed bag. The region has suffered from repeated wars. Conflicts such as Palestine have not been solved, and the US government has, in the view of many local governments, meddled in politics in ways that are often annoying and sometimes troublesome. I think a lot of governments see a relationship with China as a way of providing the material benefits that they get from their US ties with less baggage. But there's also a sense that China is unlikely to provide the sort of defensive bulwark to these countries that the United States has provided for the last several decades. I think China has managed to build this tremendous enthusiasm despite a fair amount of uncertainty about what China's new Western-facing strategy entails and what the broader consequences of deeper Chinese investment might be, or deeper Chinese involvement might be for China's partners. One of the things that I find remarkable is the assumption that every country seems to have that it can be really important to China, right? And this reminds me, I remember about 5-10 years ago, there was a story about tourists who go to Egypt and they go to the pyramids and they feel they're all a reincarnation of ancient Egyptians. And a remarkable number of them think that they are the reincarnation of Cleopatra. I mean, everybody always goes for the top, right? And there's this assumption that the UAE can be an important node, and Qatar can be an important node, and Oman can be an important node, and Iran also, of course, it makes sense to be the important node. Everybody projects their own country to be the central node in China's strategy. I think one of the important things to keep in mind is China systematically establishes ties in such a way that it is far more important to the country it's dealing with than vice versa. And the example I want to remind you of is Iran. China represents 33% of Iran's total trade. Iran represents less than 1% of China's trade. That's a big difference. Who's in the driver's seat? China is clearly in the driver's seat because Iran is so reliant on China, but China is not similarly reliant on Iran for its $4 trillion in trade. China systematically looks to establish principally bilateral relations rather than multilateral relations with individual countries in ways that make China the dominant power. If you have a multilateral agreement, then everybody plays by the rules. If you have a bilateral agreement with China and China controls 33% of your trade and you're 1%, China is the stronger power. And that's the kind of relationship China seeks to create. It creates a certain wariness of the debt traps that China creates. And we've seen it not just in Sri Lanka, but we've seen it in Indonesia, Myanmar, and elsewhere. Increasingly, Australia is growing concerned with the nature of its bilateral ties with China. In addition, the government of China has shown little interest in promoting transparency and anti-corruption efforts as it's extended into markets in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. And it appears ambivalent about multilateral agreements and organizations in which it doesn't have an outsized role. While bribery of foreign officials has been illegal in China since 2011, up to 2018, I've been unable to find a single case in which China's prosecuted anybody for bribing foreign officials. The commercial deals that China makes aren't part of a rules-based order. That China has made no effort in countries that I'm aware of to try to strengthen commercial codes, try to strengthen the judiciary, the sorts of things that Western governments have been trying to do in the Middle East for decades. I think this creates a question because while there are lots of examples of Chinese communities in Saudi Arabia and in Southeast Asia and elsewhere who have engaged in commerce for centuries, we don't have that very long track record of the Chinese state and what kinds of patterns the Chinese state will seek to create over time. Over time, will China leave states richer or poorer? Will China leave states more developed or less developed? Will China use debt traps to embed its military, as the United Kingdom did in in Egypt between 1882 and 1956? I think these are questions, and they're questions because ultimately we don't really know how China is going to see its global role, how China's global role will develop and what it'll mean. Will China be a major driver of global development? And if so, does it seek to exist alongside other global players, displace other global players, or compete with other global players? China's growth has been slowing. Will it stay slow? Or will it pick up again? If it stays slow, how long will it stay slow? And how will that affect China's ambition to reach beyond China? What kind of security arrangements is China going to seek to make to secure an increasingly global set of interests, especially if tensions with other powers continue to rise? Will China alter the pattern, which it's exhibited so far, of being principally an economic power alongside more conventional global powers? Or as Minister Chan said yesterday, will China deploy diplomatic and military power in conventional ways to defend its economic interests? I'm going to make a prediction, and that is that hydrocarbons are going to be less central to the future of global security in 25 years than they are right now. What does that mean for China's interest in the Middle East? Will China's interest in the Middle East diminish in 25 years compared to now? And knowing, because they're developing alternative energy and they're developing electric cars and all those sorts of things, if you know that you are going to be less dependent on hydrocarbons in 25 years, will you invest less in the Middle East now because it's a short-term investment? And will China making short-term investments in the Middle East create a different set of patterns than countries who want to make long-term investments in the Middle East? Along the lines of the question I asked Bing Bing yesterday, will China's focus on states rather than private business, rather than non-state actors, will the focus on states prove to be far-sighted or short-sighted as we look at the next several decades? What will the seams of China's core interests and its periphery look like? China has clear attitudes toward Southeast Asia and other countries in China's near abroad. And we've seen those patterns over hundreds of years. But as China thinks about a more global role beyond the Himalayas, will China have the same approach? Will China have a different approach? And how will that matter? How will great powers perceive China's actions, and how will they respond? Will they cede regions to China? Will smaller powers seek to balance against what they see as Chinese efforts at domination? Will the Indo-Pacific, as Ehud suggested, emerge as an area of contestation, obstructing China's clear access to the Middle East and setting off a rivalry with India? I think the answer to all those questions that I raised depends on decisions that China hasn't made yet. I honestly think that the Chinese government, the Chinese scholars, haven't answered those questions in their own mind. It depends on things that haven't happened yet. There is clearly rising skepticism toward China in Africa after more than a decade of large-scale Chinese investment there, and that may be a harbinger. I think the most important question we have to ask in terms of this conference is how long China will feel a need to engage deeply in the Middle East, to invest deeply in the Middle East, and what effects the Middle East will be of a potentially short-term Chinese investment in the future of the region. Thank you.
Thank you for articulating clearly a number of questions facing China's expansion along the BRI, and introducing what I would say a note of skepticism to the issue. I think that puts us in a great position to start the concluding roundtable discussion open to everybody in the conference. So would anybody like? I'm sorry? No. Please, gentlemen, would you like to start? And as I said, the articulations by the panelists, the roundtable panelists, who have been very clear, are just a beginning point for our discussion. So you need not frame it as a question for a specific roundtable discussion.
Okay, let me ask Mr. Altman and also Mr. Wang, Professor Wang, respectively. My name is Shikata, Japan Forum International Relations. I understand whatever happens, the United States will continue to be a major player, not only in the Middle East, but also in the world. But also have a little bit of concern about the possible difference between President Trump himself and his staffs on the Middle East policies, like withdrawal of Syria and so on. And also, after the next election, what is going to happen to the United States society itself? Because there seems to be a fundamental change going on, such as a new nationalism is may be going on, or socialism may appear. So let me ask you if there's any such a fundamental change going on in the US, how does it influence in the US foreign policy? As the Professor Wang, let me ask you one thing about Djibouti. You pointed out that the geopolitics is not a good word for China. But looking at the Djibouti military base, that is by far the largest military base, much larger than the United States. In that, it's stationed maximum 10,000 soldiers, and it has also underground facility. Why does China need such a big military base in Djibouti? Thank you.
Thank you. If I knew where American politics were going, I would be the only American who did. Nobody really knows where American politics are going. I think with regard to the Middle East, I would point to a consistency between the Obama administration and the Trump administration, which is, I think, a widespread and growing sense that the US was too focused on the Middle East, devoted too many military and other resources, not just military, but military and other resources toward the Middle East. And those investments haven't yielded what was expected. The US put more than $1 trillion into Iraq. which is a lot of money, lost 5,000 soldiers, and I don't think there are a large number of Americans who think that that was a wise investment. That's not to say what the alternative is. And I think you're going to see both people in the Republican Party and people in the Democratic Party articulating different alternatives going forward. I don't think you're going to see a rise of isolationism, but I do think you're going to see a rethinking about how much the United States needs in the Middle East and what the US is willing to accept in the Middle East. The interesting question, of course, is if the US is less militarily, economically, and diplomatically at the forefront in the Middle East, what does that mean for Asia, which in many ways has grown reliant on the US playing that role in the Middle East? China relies on the US to defend the sea lanes. Japan and Korea depend on the US to defend the sea lanes. If the US is playing less of a forward role, what will happen in the region and what will that mean for US allies in Asia? And that's a question that I think, frankly, nobody's begun to think through in the US.
Oh, thank you for your question. As I know, Djibouti Chinese military base, yes, publicly it's announced it's a military base, only Chinese military base in overseas. As I know, Djibouti military base basically to serve Chinese navies, because since 10 years ago, China joined other countries to safeguard the maritime security in Red Sea and the neighboring area. You know, the Somali piracies, very threatening, very destructive forces in that area. China's military base in Djibouti now, mostly, as I know, is for logistic use. And as I know, in Djibouti military base, there are other countries' military base, American military base, France, UK, even Japan. Okay, I currently don't think it will serve as a military base to send Chinese troops to the Middle Eastern country or African countries. There is no such deal right now. As for the future, I don't know. Everything will change. I don't know. Okay.
John Alterman posed a good question. If the US has been the indispensable power, especially for this region, what happens if the US withdraws? I think the case of Djibouti is a good illustration because courtesy of the Somali pirates that Jatin Dua talked about yesterday, there was a lot of disruption of maritime traffic, hijackings and so on, a $200 million cargo of Saudi oil hijacked. And so there was a sense that there was not enough security provided by the Americans or anybody else. On that basis, China was able to enter, others were able to enter, and so on. So I think Djibouti provides an interesting case of that. Small conflict not between major powers, but conflicts between what has been described as enemy of all mankind, that is to say, pirates, that has provided a consensus for all navies to come to Djibouti.
Anyway,
yes.
To be fair, the international response to Somali piracy was led by the United States. China was invited in through the shared awareness and deconfliction exercises, right? I mean, China initially didn't want to come because China was afraid that the US would spy on the Chinese Navy. The US said, no, come in. I forget how many countries. It was a huge multilateral effort led by the United States. And the question is, if the United States is not going to lead multilateral efforts, if the United States is not going to bring China into those kinds of security exercises, what is the consequence for threats to security like that? Will navies have ad hoc cooperation? Will threats grow? To me, the Somali piracy example is precisely an example of the United States leading when no other country can lead, and leading multilateral efforts when other countries can do that. And the consequences, I think, may be quite important going forward.
So, if you put it that way, is the Somali piracy issue a high point of multilateral cooperation under the umbrella of US leadership, which provides a coordinating function but is insufficient for providing security, therefore inviting the Chinese in? Is that a good model for Chinese engagement in the Middle East?
I think so. Actually, China publicly welcomed American role in the Middle East, just our top leader said, to try to help to resolve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And as I know, China, U.S., we have very good cooperation in the anti-drugs movement, and also in the Middle East, fight terrorism. Although China didn't join American-led international coalition, as I know, more than 60 countries, but actually China support. China provide Iraq and some neighboring countries of the drone and other weapons. And there's no opposition from US. Yes. To fight against ISIS or Al-Qaeda, because they are terrorists, the common enemy of the world, not only to the Western countries, also to China.
So, am I hearing from both of you that the Middle East, in fact, may be a space of exception of Chinese-US geostrategic rivalry? That in fact, whether you want to call it geostrategic or non-geostrategic, the Middle East may be a place in which China and the US can actually have complementary relations. I'll just put that up and have some more. Yeah, sure.
10 years ago, I was in Beijing and I spoke to some people. This was when this was a little more than 10 years ago. It was when the outcome of the Iraq War was not clear. And I remember telling Chinese former military think tank folks that when the Iraq War was over, China would be allowed to bid on oil projects like any other country. And people scoffed and laughed and thought it was stupid. And the United States would never fight a war and allow other people to bid. And I explained that no, that the American idea was not that we would control the oil in Iraq. And that wasn't why we fought the war. The question, frankly, is when China either fights wars or extends power or does other things that expend Chinese resources, is the Chinese approach the same as the American approach, which is you can bid, you can compete, you can do all those things, or is it a more colonial approach where we fought the war and now we control the assets? And that, ultimately the question of whether we're moving toward more open markets or more closed markets is, I think, at the core of how this plays out.
Ehud, you wanted to say something?
Yes, please. My friend John is chairing the Brzezinski chair in CSIS. And a competitor of Brzezinski, Dr. Kissinger, will tell you that in his mind, the United States should move as fast as President Trump would possibly want, but he's not allowed to, for a rapprochement with Russia in order to form a stronger axis to contain China. That's Kissinger, not me talking. But Iraq was mentioned, and I would quickly, 2 points. 1 point. The game changer in the Middle East is Iraq, nowhere else. If the pro-Iranian proxies in Iraq, whether parliamentarians or militias, manage to get the Americans out of Iraq, and they are talking about it, manage to get the Americans out of Iraq, it's a whole new set of calculations for China. Because the untapped oil reserves of Iraq are unequaled. unequaled. And that would be a new ball game for Beijing too. The more immediate issue is, does China listen to Mr. Putin when he says, hey guys, why don't you take upon yourself the major reconstruction of Syria? Maybe $200 billion or more. And that's a potential game changer too. And I think what happens in these two spheres is going to have important impact on how the BRI is moving in the Middle East. Thank you.
Okay, Professor Wang.
Actually, I still remember China first publicly announced China also suffered from terrorist activity immediately after the 9/11 attack, publicly. Before that, China didn't, publicly announce that. So after that, China, repeatedly hoped to conduct cooperation with American government. Unfortunately, some of the Qaeda, jihadists from Xinjiang, from East Turkish separatist movement, later when they sent back from Guatemala, prison, they didn't go back to China. They go to other countries like Albania. So that give a very uncomfortable, impression for China. Anyway, China hoped to cooperate with the United States. I would like to express my personal opinion now here that no other country now in the Middle East can replace the American role. I admit that. You can imagine if suddenly American withdraw its troops from Qatar, from Syria, from many other countries, can Middle East immediately enjoy the peace and stability? In that way, we need US troops currently stay there. Personally, that is not government opinions. So, because we need time. So we hope international cooperation, local countries and the big powers. So, anyway.
I hear convergence or consensus, I don't know, at least convergence between Professor Wang and Jon, that number one, US protection in the Middle East is a good thing, number one. Number two, protection does not mean monopoly. You set Iraq up, well, originally as a sort of protectorate, but then as a sovereign state, but keeping the doors open to the world for trade. And I think that seems to be a clear consensus here. Ehud seems to think that there may be a game changer in Iraq. Let's leave it at that. And Mr. Jaffrey has a question.
Thank you, Professor Ho. My name is Hassan Jaffrey. I have a split personality. I do political risk work in an investment environment. I've spent quite a bit of time in the Middle East last 10 years, 12 years, building investment profile for one of our big companies in Singapore. I have a couple of questions and observations. One, Professor Wang's fairly good exposition of how the Chinese government sees its role in the world. But I'm also curious, and how does that square with China as a permanent member of the National Security Council, where you cannot have your cake at 82. You do need to take positions, you do need to have alignment, you do need to, on all the issues that you mentioned, China does take a position. Number one. Number two is in terms of the emergence of China as a power, whether it's the Middle East or somewhere beyond it, you have a couple of issues, right? One is that you have an aging society. You're going to be old before you get rich, right? And how does that change ultimately China's ability to project its global power? Number one. Number two, there's an implicit sort of assumption that the political structure in China remains unchanged, whether it's over the next 20 years, 50 years, we don't know, right? Is that a fair enough assumption to make? So those are questions or thoughts that I have that are China related. Mr. Yaari, thank you for bringing Israel into the picture because I think we were missing it, both from a political perspective and also from an economic perspective. The question I have for you is one of the changes that have happened in the last 5 years is the discovery of natural gas in Iran. You know, there used to be only two countries, Iran and Qatar, which are large natural gas producers. But I think we have to add Israel to that also. How does that change both Israel's view of the Middle East itself and Israel's view of how it sells a natural gas product beyond just Europe? Thank you very much.
Yes, true. China is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. That's why China had to vote on Syria resolutions. Maybe you already noticed that there's a little bit difference between China and Russia. Until now, as I know, China just voted 6 times. Russia voted more than maybe 8 or 9. You know, of course, China must must express its position, but at the same time, you may also find that our former Prime Minister Wen Jiabao publicly answered the question from Al Jazeera television correspondent in Beijing that China no private interest in Syria. That's several years ago, in the year 2012. But now I'm not so sure because after post-Syrian reconstruction, I'm sure China will play a great role because Syrian government already issued a lot of invitation for Chinese companies. And in Beijing, even Syrian ambassador to our university to discuss the possibilities of China's contribution to the post-Syrian war reconstruction. But because they think Russia is not enough for its financial sources, China could play such role. For your another question, yes, China really already become old before rich. Yeah, population issue is a very serious issue. Yeah, maybe after several years, when I reach the age of retirement, maybe in Beijing, more than 30% of the people become the old man. Their age more than 60 years old. Yeah, serious question, problem. So that I think, must have an influence to your second question, China's future politics. I don't know. This because beyond my expertise, but I believe nothing is permanent. Anything could possible. Thank you.
I think the Syria case is an interesting one because the war seems to be dying down, although I won't predict that it will completely stop. But in Syria, one can roughly say that the victors, Russia and Iran, basically don't have the money to put in for Syrian reconstruction. The US, as not a victor, will not want to put money into Syria. And in that sense, I think that leaves China a clear way as an investor in Syria, probably without objection from any side. I would note that China actually Huawei has invested a few $1 billion in Syria, which has been stuck with the war, and perhaps that might lead to new issues. I don't know, but I think Syria is an interesting case.
Just a word about Syria. If China was to shoulder the main part of this huge reconstruction of a totally devastated country, you should see the aerial photos. If China was going to do that, then they have to sing in Beijing about the fact that there is something that we in Israel call the war between the wars going on. There is an intensive Israeli campaign to disrupt Iranians' effort to establish a war machine in Syria. Is China going to be there, or wants to be there? They are watching the Russians, who are in a bit sensitive situation in Syria because of that. That's a question mark that I'm just putting to you. To the East Med. I think I can tell you responsibly that in the Israeli exclusive economic zone in the East Mediterranean, there is at least 4 times the amount of gas that was officially declared so far. There are a variety of reasons why they didn't declare more. Number 2, Israel regrets the fact that we have allowed the tax regulator, nobody likes him anyway, but we have allowed the tax regulator to scare away the big, giant Australian company, Woodside. And Woodside wanted to take the gas to Asia. They are experts in Asia, West Australia, gas fields, etc. That was a huge mistake. We have granted too much liberty to the tax regulator. Certainly, if you ask my accountant. Now the gas is going to go to Egypt and then be re-exported as LNG. It's going to Jordan. It's going to the Palestinian Authority for Israeli consumption, but the main bulk will hopefully be going through a pipeline from the Israeli gas fields to the island of Crete in Greece, and from there to southern Italy to feed Europe. That's how it stands now.
Thank you. Mr. Anthony Teo?
Oh, I was about to go. Yeah. I have a follow-up on John's point on opportunism. And it has to do with 2 things. Your issue that you raised and the opening remarks that Engseng said about the issue of addiction in this transaction. And if we look into PRC interests, for example, in Africa, they did the BRI early in 1975. They did the Tanzam Railway with Nyerere and Jomo Kenyatta, with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, who was very close to Africa. That is one of the most successful projects the Chinese ever had in Africa, and very successful. But what has happened now is what John is talking about, that the relationship seems to be more uneven. It's like in the old days of uneven treaties. But he got to answer one question. The Americans are not free of this, because the Americans have always devoted very good ambassadorial staff to China, all the way from John Holdridge to Winston Lord to George H.W. Bush and his friend J. Stapleton Roy. They are all China hands. In fact, J. Stapleton Roy was born in Nanjing. Now, who do they have in Beijing now? They have a transaction person who is very keen on Iowa farm products, who happens to have a relationship in the old days with a young agricultural officer. But that type of understanding which is needed in an inflection time now requires a lot more of America that you have exhibited before, that now you look at it as a commercial transaction. And in the recent transaction where the trade negotiations were, one of the concessionary roles that the negotiator did was to import 1 million tons of soybeans. And guess who gets it? It's somewhere around Iowa. But the policy has to be a bit more broad and deep.
None of my friends would be surprised to know that I voted for a candidate for president who did not win.
give a comment? Yes. China's relationship with both Middle Eastern countries and African countries really changed. Uh, in the, during the Chairman Mao era, so at that time, China's aid to Africa without condition and also without, self-interest. At that time, China also poor. African, the Tanzania and the railway. But now, because many Chinese companies, private companies, even the state-owned companies, they want to earn money, they want to profit. So maybe Chinese government call on Chinese companies go to Africa, go to Middle East to invest, but the company should seriously think about the risks. The risks. I think now this is the new issue. As I know, even some, China even now keep the tradition of every year send some doctors to African countries to serve. As I know, I met some doctors. Now even the doctors it's hard to send to the continent because China now many doctors already become rich. Till the Mao era, maybe they go there to get some dollars, maybe. But now it's hard for the Beijing doctors go to some poor African countries to serve for several years. I mean, everything's changing. And also the relation. But one thing is still there, the friendship. China is still quite different from the Western powers.
I think the question of Chinese doctors in Africa is a very interesting one. China used to send doctors to Africa for decades, just as Cuba also did. This was state-to-state relationship. What has happened in Africa is very interesting, especially in Sudan. What has happened apparently is that these Chinese doctors who were sent to Sudan, and later when the state has been pulling back this medical assistance, what has happened is that the Chinese doctors in Sudan have actually gone private. And they've not only been operating in North Sudan, they have actually also been extending their business to South Sudan, where nobody wants to go because of war.
Tell the story, personal story. In the year 2010, we, Peking University, with some professors, went to make a field trip to say, what's the possibility between North Sudan and South Sudan after division? So we went to Juba. We met some Southern Sudan people, professors and the people in the streets. They still hold a good memory of Chinese doctors. So maybe this is one of the reasons for the Sudan divided, but immediately Southern Sudan, the president went to Beijing to establish diplomatic relations with China.
Yes, the Sudan-China doctor story gets even more interesting because, as I've said, as the state has pulled back, the private doctors have expanded to southern Sudan where nobody else wants to go, number one. Number two, it is also linked to what is happening in China, because in China, the expectations or standards for medical treatment have gone up, such that the kinds of doctors who used to be called barefoot doctors, the demand for their services has actually gone down. So what you see is an expansion in Sudan of these barefoot doctors who get training in Shenzhen and then retrain in Shenzhen in higher standards, go to Sudan, and have actually expanded medical services to a place suffering from war in Africa. So this story is an interesting story because there has been a huge expansion of Chinese enterprise across Africa. So there's a very interesting book by a lady, Irene Yuan Swan, called The Next Factory of the World. She grew up until 6 years old in China, went to the US, I think studied at Harvard Business School, is now working for McKinsey. She did a big survey of Africa and found that, I don't know, 6,000 or there are thousands of Chinese individuals who have set up factory in China without government support. And her claim is that this may be a next wave of industrialization of Africa as China moves up the manufacturing scale, as labor costs become very high, individual Chinese entrepreneurs are finding that Africa is a place where they can actually make money because the labor costs are very low. So that's part of a larger story. And I think that's an interesting story, which is a story we haven't been pursuing because we've been doing a lot of state-to-state relations. Yes, John?
The other
So that is not a geostrategic
Yeah.
story. That's a different type.
I mean, the other interesting story is Chinese labor overseas, both Chinese labor and construction. And a lot of the infrastructure that Chinese companies built is built by Chinese laborers overseas, and it's seen as an export of China's unemployment problem. And there's also the fact that, for example, in the free trade zone area in Jordan, Chinese factories staffed by Chinese workers in a country with relatively high levels of unemployment. So one of the things that I think we have yet to see the long-term consequences of is sometimes Chinese enterprise leaving China means Chinese workers also leave China, and the Chinese enterprise doesn't create as many local jobs as people might like. The other thing, of course, is Chinese workers bring alcohol and pork, which I'm told is central to many Chinese lives, but is not central to the lives of people in the Middle East, and that also creates moments of tension, certainly in Algeria and elsewhere.
Yes, gentleman in the back.
My name is Yongguk Ryu. I teach at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. So my research actually covers China, but I don't cover Middle East. So as a result, in the past 2 days, the presentations here at this conference were especially beneficial to me. So I've learned a lot, so I thank you. I have 2 points, one small and one slightly bigger. The small point is something that Professor Wang mentioned in your presentation. So you said BRI is a public good contribution made by China, but in fact, I don't think that is actually quite true, right? So the definition of public good has 2 criteria, so non-rivalry and non-excludability. And obviously, so what this means is you cannot exclude people from participating, right? And then the benefits that you consume should not reduce the amount of benefits available to others. Whereas BRI, the benefits will go to the participants, and then the benefits that you consume, right, will reduce the benefits available to others. I think what you actually meant was it's a win-win situation for the participants. Now, the reason that I'm bringing this up is I think it's important to reduce perceptual gap between China and many other countries around the world. So if the Chinese government thinks that BRI is a public good, and as a result, it's going to believe that what it does is always going to serve the collective benefits of the international community, then that's obviously going to generate a lot of problems because there are countries that will not agree with that sort of perspective. So I think it's important to reduce that perceptual gap. My bigger point is this. So if you look at China's engagement with Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and the West, and also around the world, and this point goes to every panelist here, since the end of the Second World War, the general story is very similar, right? So high optimism, sort of very sort of positive evaluation of China initially, right? And then in the contemporary era, there's a rising suspicion of China's strategic intentions. So take Japan, for example. The Japanese government never treated the Communist Party as a communist party, as a red communist. Right? So the Japanese government in the immediate post-war era always argued that the Chinese Communist Party were nationalist primarily and communist only secondarily. Now that view has changed, right, dramatically. So if you look at the Japanese discourse nowadays, the emphasis on China as a communist country has increased. Right? I'm not blaming China for this, right? I mean, this has a lot to do with domestic politics in Japan. Certainly that has put these countries apart quite a bit. You go to Southeast Asia, right? So the China-Southeast Asian relations have gone through ups and downs, but on the whole, it was sort of positive development up until very recently, right? So the ASEAN created ARF primarily to accommodate the rise of China. And then for a moment, there was a positive evaluation of China's participation in ARF. But now, with China's military activities in the South China Sea, there are a lot of concerns among Southeast Asian countries. You take the West, right? So West welcomed China's rise, right? And then brought China in the international institutional framework. Now I think there's a widespread suspicion that this past evaluation of China has not actually benefited much, right, the West. Therefore, you see this sort of backlash against China in many Western countries. Now, I'm saying this, right, not to put sort of damp water over this sort of positive thing going on between the Middle East and China, and also the past should not dictate the future. But I think we need to learn lessons from China's past engagement with other parts of the world in order to manage how China and the Middle Eastern countries can develop their relations. So my question to the panelists is, what sort of lessons do you think that China and the Middle East as a region can learn from other parts of the world, China's past engagement going forward? Thank you.
Okay, that's quite an open question to the panelists. Shall we, do you guys want to answer this question, or shall we? Okay.
Okay, first, thank you for your kind advice. By using public goods, not from the government, my personal. Official document didn't mention the public goods, but official document really mentioned China want to build, in Chinese language, 人类命运共同体. To build the human common destiny. For me, I think, personally, I think I define this as Chinese public good. If it's not correct, it doesn't matter. Personally, I take the responsible. But China, you mentioned Japanese description about China's communist country, communist party. Although I'm not expert in this area, but one thing I do know, our official language is that China is a socialist country with Chinese characteristics. This is official language. We are Communist Party, true, that's true. As for others, as for the lessons, I think every country should learn the lessons, not only China, not only maybe United States or other countries. Currently, I think we learn lessons, especially from United States. We always think United States is a mirror for Chinese foreign policy, especially for China's diplomatic or other activities. And as I know, China currently, more than half of the Middle Eastern countries already signed bilateral agreement on the One Belt One Road. That means more than half of the Middle Eastern countries warmly welcome China's One Belt One Road initiative. Thank you.
Okay, great. We don't have much time left. One more question.
I'm John here. I'm a pilgrim to Israel since the year 2000 till now. My question is directed to Mr. Ehud. Shalom to you. Now, my personal observation, I want to ask the question about perception. I've been to Israel since then, 11 trips, and it's quite a long trip. Sometimes I go there. And the reports that I read, the newspaper that I read, and so on, and the reality when I associate and meet the Jewish people and so on, is there's a disconnect there. I mean, it's quite a very great disconnect. I find the Jewish people are very kind, compassionate, very warm-hearted. But in the newspapers, those reports, I'm not saying Singapore, they're pretty balanced and neutral. But generally, globally, why is there the such a negative report about Israel, tend to demonize every of Israel's action, victimizing Israel. Whereas I find that the Jewish people are generally very kind, Israeli people are very kind and warm-hearted. They treat the Palestinians well. And even I heard reports whereby the Palestinian terrorists who attack your children, the Jewish people, they are treated in your own hospital. They are so kind to those people. So my question to you is that, why is there such a disconnection between reality and the newspaper report and the media report? Second thing...
Thank you. I think we are out of time, so can we just have a response?
Quick one. There is a variety of reasons why the media generally, especially European media, some in the United States, is so negative about Israel. There are different reasons, whether people are anti-Jewish or they have a misperception of what's happening with the Palestinians, etc. And one of the main reasons is the fact that the Israelis are more interested in debating one another than trying to explain themselves to the world. And I'll conclude with just one sentence. There was the question how you deal with China. Well, you make business with China as much as you can, the same way that porcupines make love, slowly and carefully.
Well, that may be the conclusion to our conference, slowly but carefully. That perhaps sums up the way China may want to engage the Middle East, slowly and carefully, as opposed to hyperkinetically. That might be one way to go. I'm sure there are many other ways to go. And unfortunately, we are out of time. But I'd like to thank the roundtable participants, the audience, and all our speakers over the past 2 days for what I find a very thought-provoking sets of thoughts, which have given me actually many new things to think about, despite all the good news, bad news, and fake news that we are bombarded with these days. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good